In the name of God, who is Trinity, Holy Eternal Majesty, Holy Incarnate Word, and Holy Abiding Presence. Amen. The Bible tells us that for most of us, for much of the time, our vision is distorted, clouded. We look through our own lenses, perhaps through filters of selfish concern or fear about some potential threat to our well-being, or resentment that things haven't gone as well for us as we actually deserve. Looking through our filters, the world may appear to be indifferent to us, or the world may appear hostile to us. We rarely see what actually is there. We see external appearances, and we make judgments based on those appearances. We rarely look more deeply to see the reality that underlies our experience. But sometimes it is possible to catch a glimpse of reality, a glimpse of things as they really are, a glimpse of something that can break us out of our self-absorption, out of our fear, out of our bitterness, something that can help us see more clearly and more deeply. There is such a moment of revelation in Walker Percy's novel, The Second Coming. The main character, Will Barrett, observes a lazy cat sitting in the sun. This is how Walker Percy describes it. As Will Barrett sat gazing at the cat, he saw all at once what had gone wrong. Wrong with people, wrong with him, but not with the cat. He saw it with smiling certitude with which Einstein is said to have hit upon his famous theory in the act of boarding a streetcar in Zurich. Sitting there in the sun with all its needs satisfied, the cat was exactly 100% cat, no more, no less. As for Will Barrett, as for people nowadays, they were never 100% themselves. They occupied a place uneasily, more or less successfully. More likely they were 47% themselves, or rarely, as in the case of Einstein on the streetcar, 300%. All too often these days, they were 2%, spectators who hardly occupied a place at all. So writes Walker Percy. For Will Barrett, that lazy cat lying in the sun brought a moment of epiphany, a moment of true insight into himself and his place in the world. Seeing that cat raised deep questions and stimulated deep reflection. Our gospel lesson today tells of the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain. 3 of the disciples, Peter and James and John, see what? A kind of vision in which Jesus' clothes become dazzling white. Light shines in the darkness, and the disciples see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. A voice from the sky had spoken once before in the gospel narrative at the baptism of Jesus, and now that voice speaks again, making the same affirmation as before. This is my child, the beloved. Listen to him. That's an epiphany, a revelation, a glimpse of reality that raises deep questions and stimulates deep reflection. This is a story about the identity of Jesus, who Jesus is. Like Will Barrett looking at a cat that is 100% cat, the disciples saw in that brief moment a Jesus who is 100% who he is. They hadn't quite seen him so clearly before, perhaps because they had been distracted by outward appearances or by their own agendas or by their own expectations. Seeing a cat that was 100% there reminded Will Barrett that people are sometimes only about 47% themselves, or more likely, only about 2% themselves, spectators who are hardly there at all. The glimpse of Jesus, who was 100% who he was, reminds disciples then and now that we are only partially present, only partially the people God created us to be. Of course, the disciples are so overwhelmed by what they see that they can't quite take it all in. They think they're having some sort of exotic, ecstatic vision, that they've been transported to some sort of strange and distant place, some transcendent realm. They've been lucky enough to be chosen for this spectacular visionary experience, and naturally they would like to stay right there, enjoying their privileged experience forever, enjoying the ecstasy of this epiphany. Peter suggests that they should build tents or booths, one for Moses and one for Elijah and one for Jesus. But Peter is speaking nonsense because he is awestruck and terrified. They cannot stay there. They must move on. The story of Jesus has not yet reached its conclusion. The transfiguration of Jesus is a brief interlude in the forward movement of that story. It is about what Jesus is now, but also about what will be revealed more fully as the story unfolds. It tells the disciples where they are right now, but it also indicates where they are going. As someone has said, Jesus realized that he has one more mountain to climb, a mountain in Jerusalem. The full glory of Christ is finally seen in his cross and resurrection. This is a story about the identity of Jesus. There is more to him than initially meets the eye. On the mountain, something shows through in a way that the disciples had not quite seen before. In this moment, they see that Jesus is intimately involved with the divine reality. This is my child, the beloved. If you want to understand who Jesus is, you have to know about his connectedness, his belovedness, that is at the heart of reality, at the heart of God. What the disciples now see in the face of Jesus is the face of God's love. In Jesus, the love of God becomes real, touchable, human, part of our world. What the disciples see and hear about Jesus in the Transfiguration tells us something important about ourselves. The disciples see and hear the depths of who Jesus is. And in that revelation, we learn that we too have hidden depths, that we too are beloved children of God. The whole world is in God's hands. The whole world is embraced in this basic connectedness, this basic belovedness. But we have a hard time believing that the promise is really meant for us. We have a hard time placing our faith in that. We have a hard time seeing the world that way. According to Mark, when they heard the voice from the cloud declaring Jesus to be God's child, the disciples fell to the ground and were overcome with fear. It was a lot to take in. It was almost too much. Instead of finding this revelation of the glory of God shining through Jesus to be a simple comfort and a straightforward encouragement, they were shaken to the bone. They fell down trembling. And when Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid," their fears were quieted by that simple human touch. The glory of God, the God who made the heavens and the earth and all that is, the God whose greatness is so vast that it exceeds human comprehension. The glory of God shines through Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration. To see the glory of God is more than anyone can bear. That same incomprehensible God, immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes, as the wonderful old hymn says, that incomprehensible God comes to us in a human hand placed upon the shoulder, along with the words, "Do not be afraid." And then Jesus leads them back down the mountain, back to the mundane, unspectacular life they had always known. They returned to the messiness of life and to their journey to Jerusalem and to Golgotha. We live in uncertain times, dangerous times, contentious times, polarized times, times of vulnerability. What we desperately need to discover and claim for ourselves is the invitation to live as children of promise. We live in a world that is in turmoil. It is a very disturbing prospect for many of us. We can disagree about important issues, but we are called to unite in prayer for the common good, for the good of those who are on the margins, even when we might disagree about how the common good might be achieved. Through prayer, we engage in discernment, in dialogue with the one who claims us as beloved children. Preacher Ted Loder puts it this way: the gospel is God saying, "I'll be the face of love for you. Whoever you are, I am with you. Wherever you are, I am there in love for you, in every face you see, in the face of creation itself. Trust me, the light in the darkness, deep as midnight though it seems." Ted Loder calls this the haunt of grace. He says it is the response God invites us to make again and again, and always again. At last, it comes down to this: no matter how much wattage we try to generate on our own, before love can truly shine in our face, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus needs to shine in our soul somehow, in whatever way we can let it happen. So, what do we see when we look at our world? Do we see only what is on the surface, the appearances, or do we glimpse a deeper reality, the imperishable life of God's Spirit, the promise that is offered to us in love? Let me conclude with a litany appropriate for this Transfiguration Sunday, even as it is appropriate for this moment in history. It is a reminder, once again, of the light that shines in darkness. In the midst of hunger and war, we celebrate the promise of plenty and peace. In the midst of oppression and tyranny, we celebrate the promise of service and freedom. In the midst of doubt and despair, we celebrate the promise of faith and hope. In the midst of fear and betrayal, we celebrate the promise of joy and loyalty. In the midst of hatred and death, we celebrate the promise of love and life. In the midst of sin and decay, we celebrate the promise of salvation and renewal. In the midst of death on every side, we celebrate the promise of the living Christ. Amen. And thanks be to God who makes it so.